Ever since we started dating, my then girlfriend Katie and I were into urban exploration. At one point, we decided to drive cross-country to visit one of her friends from college, so we could both take a break from work and have fun seeing different landmarks. We lived near Atlanta, and her friend was in Denver, so we had our driving cut out for us. Because we were taking it slow, it would take us a week to drive there and another to drive back. I'll skip a lot of the details that aren't relevant to the story, but I will say that for the first part of our trip, we went through Nashville and St. Louis. We ended up spending a full day in St. Louis and saw the Arch, as well as Union Station, and basically walked all over the city. We were pretty exhausted that night, and after waking up the next morning, we got on the road around 9 a.m. We were following I-70 to Kansas City, and 100 miles or so outside of St. Louis, Katie had to pee, so we looked for a place to pull over. There was an exit with a gas station and nothing else, and after using the restrooms and getting gas, we were about to get back on the highway. But then Katie pointed at something in the distance and asked me what it was. I looked out the passenger side window and saw a huge gray structure in the background. Now, maybe you think this is weird, but both of us knew what the other was thinking, and we just had to drive over and see what it was. We turned back and continued down the road with the gas station. We quickly found ourselves in the middle of crop fields, which I think were soybeans. As we made our way towards the structure, we realized it was a truly massive warehouse. Think of that scene at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, or the warehouse in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. To us, it wasn't enough to just figure out what it was. We needed to drive around in the parking lot and see it up close. As we turned onto one of the roads leading into the lot, a few things struck us as odd. First, the place was completely deserted. It didn't look dilapidated though, so we figured it was still under construction. For context, this was before COVID, so it wasn't like it would have been affected by the lockdowns. Second, there weren't any company names or logos on it. It was literally just a warehouse. It had mostly concrete walls, places where 18-wheelers could load and unload, and what looked to be a front office area. We drove all the way around it, which took like 10 minutes, and confirmed it was completely empty. We didn't see any cars in the parking lot anywhere. Now, it was kind of bizarre. I'm not sure if anyone's seen the mini-series The Langoliers, but it reminded me of the abandoned airport terminal. Both Katie and I really wanted to see what, if anything, was inside. This was also during the day, and there were numerous security cameras all around the place. We kept driving until we made our way back to where we came in, which was by the office area. Just then Katie dropped an F-bomb, and I looked in her direction. She told me someone had been standing behind one of the doors. I would have immediately suspected she was joking, but something about the way she said that seemed genuine. This is the part where we probably should have just driven off, but being the intrepid explorers we were, we decided to park and walk up to the front doors. Katie and I assumed it was fine to do, as there weren't any signs telling us to keep off, and these did appear to be the front doors after all. We parked in the front of the lot about 50 feet away and started walking over. It was overcast and a bit windy, which made the experience even more fun for some reason. We didn't feel too paranoid since we could just run back to our car if anything shady happened. Katie and I got to the front doors, which we saw had two sets, kind of like the entrance to a mall or a large supermarket. We peered in and saw a reception type area beyond the second set of doors, though we couldn't make out all the details since it was shrouded in darkness. The next logical move was to try opening the doors, so that's exactly what we did. I joked with Katie that the first door I tried would be unlocked, and though she laughed, it was. Out of curiosity, we tried the 5 other outside doors, and sure enough, all of them were open too. That was fairly strange, since even though this warehouse wasn't open yet, whoever owned it would have almost certainly wanted to protect their investment. Katie and I were both a bit sketched out now, at least more so than when she saw the person. We agreed to try to open the inner doors, poke our heads into the lobby, and then leave. I held one of the doors open for Katie, who joked that it really shouldn't be ladies first in this situation, and we stepped into the little area between the 2 sets of doors. It felt a bit warmer than the cool breezes outside, but not by much. Since I opened the first door, Katie insisted on opening the second one. Somehow we had a hunch that all the doors in the second set would be unlocked, and we were right. All that was left was to walk through the second set and into the lobby, but just then Katie let out a scream. I turned around to see 2 men standing outside by my car. My blood ran cold, and I'm sure Katie's did as well. For a brief second, I contemplated our options. We could either try to run outside, confront those men, or go further inside the building. Given that we were literally in the middle of nowhere, none of those seemed appealing. I told Katie to stay where she was and to run if anything went down. She begged me not to go, but honestly, I doubt we could have gotten away from whoever those people were without being in a car. The experience of walking back outside and over to my car was completely surreal. And even now I don't know how I summoned the courage. The men were dressed in all black, including black hoodies, sweatpants, gloves, and shoes, and they just stood there, motionless. They had neutral expressions, but something looked off about their faces. As I approached them, I figured out what it was. They were mannequins. I stopped for a second, again not knowing how to react. I looked back at Katie, who was looking at me while periodically turning around and looking into the lobby. She noticed me stop and turn, but didn't know why. My next instinct was that someone was hiding under or behind my car, or else behind one of the mannequins. Maybe it was the adrenaline in my veins, but I ran towards my car and then behind it. No one was there, including behind the mannequins, so I ducked down and looked under the car. No one was there either. Next I tried each of the doors in the trunk, and they were all still locked. I motioned for Katie to come towards me, but she was too frightened. Therefore, I got in my car, started it, and drove right up in front of the doors. I didn't want to take any chances in case whoever put the mannequins there came back. When I pulled up, Katie ran outside and got in my car. I sped away as she put her seatbelt on. I looked behind us, expecting to see something or someone, but it was only those 2 mannequins until things faded from view. We got back on the highway and drove for a solid 2 hours before pulling off again. Katie and I didn't say much, and we were both still trying to process what the hell just happened. Finally, we pulled off and ate at a Wendy's, and only then did we start to talk things through. The best theory we could come up with was that there was a security guard or guards who got bored and set up the mannequins to mess with anyone who drove up. Assuming the security cameras were working, the guards would have been able to see us approaching and come to the doors hoping we'd see them and either freak out or become curious. Then maybe they could have snuck through a side entrance we hadn't seen walking up. The rest of the trip actually went fine, but we still couldn't help but think about the unanswered questions. Even if that person or persons did work there, how did they manage to get to the car, set up the mannequins, and get away so quickly without being seen? I thought we had only been checking the doors for less than a minute, though maybe it was longer. We also hadn't seen another car anywhere in the parking lot, so perhaps those people had been dropped off? But infinitely more frightening was the possibility that whoever was there didn't work there. Maybe they were part of a smuggling operation, or even a cult. In any case, I'm just glad we didn't go further into that building and find out. The story took place in the mid-90s, but even decades later, it's still the most bizarre thing I've experienced, and that's saying something. I was in my 20s and had just landed a job at an advertising company and wanted to start climbing the corporate ladder. Things were going pretty well, and after a few months I got to go to this professional development conference in Little Rock, Arkansas, which was about 300 miles from where I lived. Something in my personality always made me enjoy road trips, so I decided to drive there and back instead of taking a flight. Therefore, on one sunny Tuesday morning, I threw my bags in my Chevy Camaro and hit the road. I was planning to make the trip all in one day, but would still have time to stop for meals. Around midday, I pulled off the highway when I saw a sign for Wendy's. When I got there, I noticed it was in a rather large shopping center that appeared to still be under construction. Many of the units were still empty, and there wasn't much landscaping. For some reason, that made me want to take a brief detour and explore a bit. I also needed to stretch my legs. Therefore, after I finished eating, I walked back outside and over to the storefronts. There was one large awning that ran along almost all of the shopping center, and coupled with the warm air but cool breeze, it was the perfect break from driving. I must have wandered around for 10 minutes or so before I came to a video game store. It was about the size of a GameStop, though I'm pretty sure it was just a local place. I went inside and greeted the 2 employees working there, and then started looking around. If I remember right, the original PlayStation had been out for about a year. There were 2 teenagers playing a game on one of the display consoles. I remember the game revolved around this toy soldier traveling around a room and fighting other toys. I almost thought it was from Toy Story, but I'm pretty sure that it wasn't. It was also rather strange. I remember one of the bosses was this baby in a tuxedo. I don't even think it was on the PlayStation or N64. Anyway, I'd probably been distracted for 5 or so minutes when I noticed a figure standing outside the store window. I turned to see a somewhat overweight man in his 30s wearing shorts and a windbreaker. At first I thought he was watching the game too, since the TV had been facing the windows, no doubt to catch the eye of shoppers walking around outside. But he didn't seem to be watching it though. Rather, he was just staring blankly ahead into the store. I expected him to either come inside or keep walking, but instead he just continued to stand there. Eventually one of the employees, a girl around my same age, noticed the man. I think we were both creeped out by now. She said something to her coworker, who was a guy, and he walked over to the door, opened it, and asked if he could help the man. The 2 teenagers who had been playing that game stopped, and we were all now looking at him. Then he did something unexpected. He didn't say anything, but instead shrugged his shoulders in some kind of ambiguous expression, and then he continued to stand there. The employee didn't know what to do. A moment later he told the man that he couldn't loiter outside the store, and that he either needed to come in and make a purchase or leave. The man shrugged again, and I saw that his face seemed to have a slight grin on it. Then while the employee was working up the courage to say something else, the man slowly started walking off. We all looked at each other in a kind of what the hell just happened moment, and laughed a bit. I needed to get back on the road soon, so I bid everyone farewell and walked back outside. But when I was halfway to my car, something caught my eye and I stopped. From across the parking lot, I saw someone standing on top of one of the vacant buildings at the edge of part of the shopping center. I watched them for a moment, and when they started pacing back and forth, I became concerned. Honestly, I had no idea what to do. The obvious danger was that that person had mental issues and was considering jumping, but I wasn't completely sure they weren't just a construction worker. The shopping center wasn't finished after all. I tentatively started walking over, telling myself I'd dial 911 if I couldn't be sure that person was a worker there. When I was about 50 feet away, I realized it was the same guy from outside the video game store. He was making that same shrugging gesture while pacing around. It seemed he noticed me, because a moment later he stopped pacing and looked straight down at me. He didn't say anything, but he was grinning more this time. "Do you need anything?" I called out. He didn't move. "Do you need any help?" Again, I didn't know what to do. However, since this man had some type of mental issue and had apparently broken into and on top of a building, I figured I should call the police, so that's what I did. I explained the situation to the operator and the cops arrived within 5 minutes. That entire time our eyes were still locked on each other. I hadn't meant to stare the man down, however I wanted to try to stop him if it looked like he'd jump. When the cops pulled into the parking lot, they spotted us immediately and parked nearby. 2 officers got out and began asking the man if he was alright and if he needed anything. The man again made the gesture but didn't say anything. Right as the cops arrived where I was standing, the man stepped backwards and disappeared from view. They then asked me if I knew how the man had gotten to the roof, and I told them I was just passing through and had no idea. After confirming the front doors were locked, one of the officers went around back, while the other stayed in the front with me. A minute later, the second cop returned and informed his partner that both of the back doors to that unit were locked, and there was nothing else like a ladder or a dumpster that the man could have climbed to reach the roof. 3 different ladders led to the roof, but they had shields to prevent people from using them, and each shield was locked. There was a restaurant with people in it in that same part of the shopping center, so one of the officers went to speak with the people there as the other one continued to remain with me in case the man came back into sight. The cop who went to the restaurant returned a few minutes later with one of the employees of the restaurant, who confirmed that the units did not directly connect to each other, and that the only way to access the roof was from one of the ladders behind the stores. Luckily, the lady had a key to unlock them, and that same cop told his partner he was going to check the roof. 2 minutes later, we saw him walking around up there. He appeared to check behind the AC units, vents, and other pieces of equipment. but then the man wasn't up there apparently. At that point, the two cops called for backup and contacted whoever operated the shopping center. Long story short, they searched the rest of the buildings but couldn't find the man. That was especially surprising to me, since he seemed like he had significant mental issues and wouldn't be able to run away quickly. There was also a huge water retention pond behind the shopping center, and he'd probably have to have sprinted to get completely away before the cops came. I checked with the cops before leaving, and they thanked me for letting them know about the man and told me there was nothing else I could do. Several of the other store owners and patrons had walked over to see what was going on, including one of the employees at the video game store. It might sound strange, but I felt like we made some kind of random bond because the situation was so bizarre. Finally, I got back on the road, about 2 hours behind. I drove for 5 hours straight, aside for one stop to get gas and use the bathroom. I arrived at the hotel near the convention center around 9 o'clock at night, checked into my room, and fell asleep pretty quickly. Now maybe you think this is where the story ends, and honestly, maybe it does. In other words, I can't be entirely sure if the next part is real. 3 days later, on the last day of this conference, I was eating the catered lunch with 3 other people at one of the tables in the convention center dining room. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was standing by one of the exits to the main lobby. This time he was wearing blue jeans, but he still had on that windbreaker. And he made that same gesture with his shoulders. I stopped eating, completely baffled. Just as my curiosity got the better of me and I got up to walk over to him, he walked through the exit. I followed him and stepped out into the lobby, but it was rather crowded and I couldn't find him. In fact, I never saw him again. All these years later, I still don't know what to think. If I hadn't interacted with those other people at the video game store and the cops, I probably would have doubted the man even existed. My jury is still out about whether I really did see him that second time at the convention center. But honestly, I'm relatively sure I did see him. What exactly his deal was, and how he eluded the cops, is beyond me. And why or how he might have followed me, I know I'll never know. I worked as a delivery boy for a pizza place in West Virginia for a while after graduating high school and moving out. For the most part, it went how you'd expect it to. Our restaurant wasn't part of a chain, and we were on the smaller side. Our boss was kind of a pain, and we had our share of rude customers and incompetent staff. However, while I was working there, I had the most horrific experience of my life. I was afraid for my life, and what happened still haunts me to this day. To set the scene, it was a little past 8 on a Saturday night. We closed at 11 on Saturdays, but either way, it was rare to get calls this late. I was sitting inside talking to the 2 other people on that evening. There was Mike, who I went to high school with, and Gregory, a 30-something overweight guy that had some kind of issue. Mike would take the orders, and Gregory would bake the pies. The phone rang, and Mike went to answer it. I got up to use the restroom, and when I came back, Mike was still on the phone, while Gregory was off doing something. Mike had this look on his face like, WTF. When he saw me, he motioned for me to be quiet, and then put the customer on speakerphone. The person sounded like they were 80 and had been a heavy smoker, and to be honest, it was hard to tell if they were male or female. They were also speaking slowly and softly, so it was also hard to make out their order. The whole experience of listening to them just seemed so off-putting. Eventually, after Mike repeated himself like 5 times, he managed to get the customer's order and address. He told the customer I'd be right over and hung up the phone. I put their address into my phone. Here's where things got even weirder. We lived in a small rural town, and I never had to drive more than 15 minutes away to make a delivery before. But apparently this person lived 45 minutes away. This was at night without any traffic, mind you. I started to suspect this had been a prank, and wished Mike hadn't already hung up. All the customer ordered was a small pepperoni pizza and 2 bottles of water, so 15 minutes later I got in my car and drove off. On the way over, I replayed what just happened in my mind, and the more I did so, the more I got sketched out. There was just something about that voice. It didn't help that I was traveling further away to some place new at 9 o'clock at night. I was on a 2-lane highway leading out of town, which was deserted at this hour. There was another populated area 50 or so miles away, but the address I was headed to was literally in the middle of nowhere. Based on the Maps app on my phone, I'd eventually be turning off the highway onto one back road leading to another that supposedly ended in a kind of cul-de-sac with several houses coming off of it. In the meantime, there was nothing but hay and cornfields, shrouded in darkness. After a half hour of driving, the road finally came into view of my headlights. I slowed down and turned off. There were cornfields on either side, and low-key I started to feel like I was in a horror movie. I told myself that if anything else sketchy happened, I'd bail. 2 minutes later, I came to the other road I needed to turn on, and my fears were confirmed when I saw it was just a narrow dirt road. The cornfields came right up to it, and I could literally see nothing outside of the driver and passenger side windows. Right when I was almost to this cul-de-sac thing, something started to glint in my headlights. I slowed down, and a moment later saw that it was a barricade. My blood ran cold as the realization that I was stopping in the middle of a cornfield in the middle of nowhere sank in. The barricade appeared to be made out of old wooden picnic tables with a few of those slow-moving vehicle triangle signs tacked on. It didn't look official, and while I might have assumed it had been made by a farmer to mark a damaged piece of the road, under the circumstances I wasn't taking any chances. After stopping, I immediately started to back up, but that's when I saw something in my rearview mirror and screamed. There was a car with its lights off about 100 feet behind me. Without hesitation, I put my car in drive and took off into the cornfield. A second later, I noticed light coming through the rows of corn, meaning the other car had turned its headlights on. I drove through those crops like there was no tomorrow. I considered turning off my own headlights so I couldn't be seen as easily, but kept them on so I didn't run into anything. My hands shook as I looked down at my phone and tried to make my way back to the highway in a roundabout way. I looked back up, but I was going so fast through the corn I could barely see anything. All of a sudden I felt a sensation of weightlessness, and a moment later my seatbelt cut into my chest and the airbag deployed. I had apparently driven into an irrigation ditch. The adrenaline kept pumping in my veins, and I stomped frantically on the gas pedal. It was no good. What happened next was the most terrifying thing I've ever had to do in my life. I turned the car off, grabbed my phone, and stepped outside of my car. The front end had smashed into the other side of the ditch, and I was sure the car was totaled. I couldn't worry about that though, as I was certain I was still being chased. I ran up the other side of the ditch and back into the cornfield, as I knew I'd be seen if I tried to run down the ditch. My life flashed before my eyes when I heard the sound of a car engine get closer and two men yelling. I sprinted and changed my direction to be parallel to the rows of corn so I'd make less sound. I heard the car stop for a moment, but then start again, this time casting a faint light through the field. Its lights must have been off and then turned back on. Any second I knew the car would pull right up behind me, but by some miracle they went in another direction and the sound faded from view. I frantically looked at my phone again, all the while continuing to run. I didn't have service and it was still 2 miles to the highway, but it was almost 20 miles back to town. I considered trying to wave someone down, but the highway would still almost certainly be deserted, and who knows if those men would be driving around looking for me. I decided to try to run back through the cornfield and get close enough to the highway so I could see if anyone was driving on it, but not close enough that they'd see me. Eventually I came across the first road I turned down, and my blood ran cold again as I stopped just before I got to it and looked both ways for that car or anyone else. I didn't see anyone, so I sprinted over. 10 or so minutes later, the highway came into view from between the rows of corn. I stopped when I was about 50 feet away. I still didn't see anything. Then I started walking back, parallel to the highway but still out of view. Eventually I'd come to a hayfield where I'd be more exposed, but I couldn't mentally deal with that at the moment. I contemplated trying to find someone's house, but wasn't sure I could locate one exactly on my phone. Instead, I figured I'd get service at some point as I walked back next to the highway. 2 hours later I did, and I can't tell you how overjoyed I was to see that bar pop up. I dialed 911 and thank God that call went through. I told them what happened, along with my approximate location. 15 minutes later I saw the red and blue lights start to flash, so I tentatively walked out of the field and onto the shoulder. The cop car slowed down and stopped, and one of the police officers got out. It was 1,000 pounds off my shoulders. I told them where I thought my car was, and they called in backup and said they'd check it out. Meanwhile, they drove me back home, and when I called Mike, he was speechless. He just assumed I delivered the pizza and then drove back home. I never knew my dad, and my mom and I were estranged, so I actually didn't call her. It took me a few hours to fall asleep after I got back to my duplex, and the next day I worked with the cops to locate my car. We eventually found it, and as I already knew, it was totaled. They also found the barricade, which had been hauled off into the cornfield. But the strangest part was that when they went to those houses on the cul-de-sac, they were all abandoned. The cops searched through them, but apparently there weren't squatters or any signs they were being used. The cops questioned the man who owned the field where everything went down. He denied any knowledge of what happened and said the houses had been abandoned for at least 10 years. I assumed there was more of an investigation, but I never heard anything else. My insurance eventually came through and I was able to get another vehicle, but in the meantime I couldn't deliver pizzas. Not that I really wanted to after this incident. I managed to get another part-time job at our local Walmart, and a few months later I enlisted in the Navy. Things have been good for me since then, and now I can lead the life I wanted to. However, what happened that night still haunts me, and I can't help but replay that whole experience in my mind. There's still so many questions left unanswered. Who was that person who ordered the pizzas, and what was their deal? Who were those people who came after me? And most disturbingly, what would they have done to me if they had caught me?